At 22 minutes past 4, on a Sunday afternoon, one of the oldest fortresses in the world came apart at the seam. The blast tore a hole clean through a wall that had stood for 800 years. Crusaders had built it. Ottomans had rebuilt it. The British called it the most secure prison in the Middle East. Walls, a moat, the sea on one side, an entire hostile town on the other. And in the space of a heartbeat, a group of young men in stolen British uniforms had opened it like a tin can. What no one watching understood, not the guards, not the prisoners, not the soldiers swimming just down the beach, was that the men who blew the wall had known exactly where to strike, because the plans had come from inside the British establishment itself. Acre, on the coast of British Mandate Palestine, in the spring of 1947, the old city was a knot of stone alleys wrapped around a citadel that had guarded this shore since the age of the Crusades. The Ottomans had turned it into a fortress. The British had turned it into a jail, and made it the hardest jail in the country to escape. A deep moat cut it off to the east and north. The Mediterranean sealed the west, and all around it stood a town with no Jewish inhabitants at all, so that anyone who somehow got over the walls would still be surrounded, with nowhere to run. Inside were hundreds of Arab prisoners and around 90 Jewish ones, most of them members of the underground movements fighting to end British rule. 3 weeks before the wall came down, 4 men had walked to the gallows inside those same walls: Dov Gruner, Yehiel Dresner, Mordecai Al-Kahi, Eliezer Kashani, fighters of the Irgun, the most militant of the underground groups. Gruner had stood before a British military court and refused even to recognize it. "This court has no legal foundation," he told them. Days before he was hanged, he smuggled out a letter to his commander, Menachem Begin, on scraps of paper. "Of course I want to live," he wrote. "Who does not? But if I am sorry that I am about to finish, it is mainly because I did not manage to do enough." He was 35 years old. His death did not frighten the men still in the cells. It set them thinking about the wall. The senior Irgun prisoner inside Acre was a man named Eitan Livni. He and the others had talked about escape for months, and every time they reached the same conclusion. From the inside, it was impossible. The walls were too thick, the guards too many, the town too hostile. If it was going to happen at all, it would have to come from the outside. A break-in, not a break-out. So they sent word, through the underground's secret prison mail, to the Irgun's headquarters. Their message was simple and almost absurd. "Break into the fortress. Come and get us." And to everyone's surprise, headquarters began to plan exactly that. The whole operation turned on an accident. An Arab inmate who carried oil to the prison kitchen mentioned in passing that while working in a storeroom set into the south wall, he had heard women's voices coming through the stone. Livni understood at once what it meant. If he could hear voices from the street, then the south wall did not back onto the sea or the moat. It backed onto an alley in the old city, a place a rescue team could actually reach. The Irgun's chief of operations, Amichai Paglin, slipped into Acre disguised as an Arab and walked the ground himself. When he left, he had his answer. The wall could be breached, if the prisoners inside could fight their way to it. Now they needed explosives, inside a prison that searched everything. The answer came through the visiting room. Parents were allowed to bring their imprisoned sons food, jars of jam, oil, fruit. So the explosives came in with the food. Gelignite, packed into a tin and buried under a thick layer of jam. A British sergeant opened the tin, pushed his finger in, felt the hard lumps beneath, and accepted the explanation that the jam simply hadn't set properly. The detonators and fuse came in the false bottom of an oil can. The sergeant measured the oil with a stick and never felt the hidden compartment, thinner than your finger. Piece by piece, hidden in their food, the prisoners smuggled in enough material to build 30 grenades and 2 bombs inside the walls that held them.
You just watched one file. Dozens more are on this wall. Subscribe to catch what's next. And now, back to where you left off.
Outside, the plan took a form that was almost theatrical. If the fortress was British, then the men who came for it would be British too. The Irgun acquired the uniforms of the Royal Engineers, 20 of them, a military truck, camouflaged vans, and a command jeep. The fighters were given regulation English haircuts and told to carry themselves like His Majesty's troops. But there was a cruel arithmetic to it. Headquarters could only hide 41 escapees in safe houses. Any more, and there would be nowhere to put them. So Eitan Livni was handed the hardest job of the entire operation. From the cells full of men who all wanted to live, he had to choose. 41 would get a name on the list. The rest would watch them go. They chose their day with care. Sunday, the 4th of May, 1947, the very day the United Nations General Assembly sat down in New York to debate the future of Palestine. Whatever happened at Acre would happen in front of the world. In the early afternoon, a British military convoy rolled into the old city. A 3-ton truck, vans in army camouflage, a command jeep in the lead, and beside the driver sat a decorated British captain, in reality the assault commander, a former British commando the men knew only as Shimshon. No one stopped them. Why would they? A team in engineers' uniforms carried ladders into a Turkish bathhouse against the south wall, explaining that they had come to fix the telephone lines. They climbed to the roof, and they began, very quietly, to hang their charges on the prison windows. Inside, the clock ran on its own track. At 3, the cells opened for the afternoon walk, and the prisoners who were staying behind flooded the yard to make noise and cover. The 41 waited in their cells. Then, at 22 minutes past 4, the charges went off. The blast opened the south wall. The first group ran for the breach, blowing 2 iron gates with charges as they went, while a second group set kerosene alight to throw up a wall of fire and smoke behind them, sealing the guards out. Grenades scattered the men on the rooftops, and then the whole prison came apart. Hundreds of Arab prisoners, seeing the hole, surged toward it in panic. Guards fired into the crowd. Through the smoke and the screaming, the 41 climbed out through the wall, and behind them, roughly 200 others poured out into the city. And then the plan collided with chance. The first truckload of escapees sped out of Acre, but the driver turned the wrong way, toward the sea. On that beach, a group of British soldiers happened to be swimming. They heard the explosion, saw the truck, and grabbed their rifles. The driver swerved, struck a wall, and the vehicle overturned, spilling men out onto the road under fire. Shimshon, still dressed as a British captain, the uniform buying him a few seconds the others didn't have, tried to wave the escapees to cover, then took up a Bren gun and fired to buy them time. He was cut down where he stood. Beside him, another fighter fell. Of the 13 men in that first group, 5 were killed and 6 wounded. Some were captured alive, and then died in their cells, refused medical care. There was one more cruelty. When the operation was done, the signal to withdraw was a bugle call, but 3 men in a blocking squad, Avshalom Haviv, Mir Nakar, Yaakov Weiss, never heard it over the gunfire. While the other vehicles slipped away and vanished into the countryside, those 3 stayed at their post, waiting for an order that had already been given, until British soldiers closed in and took them. When the smoke cleared, the numbers told the story. 27 of the underground prisoners had gotten clean away. Around 200 Arab prisoners had used the same hole to disappear, but 9 fighters were dead, and 8 more recaptured, and 5 of the men who had come to set them free were now prisoners themselves. The world called it the greatest jailbreak in history. British newspapers admitted the truth of it. A strategic masterpiece, a blow to British prestige at its lowest ebb. In the House of Commons, ministers demanded to know how it had been allowed to happen. But the story was not finished. The 3 captured fighters, Haviv, Nakar, and Weiss, were sentenced to death. To save them, the Irgun seized 2 British sergeants and swore to hang them if the sentences were carried out. On the 29th of July, the British hanged the 3 men anyway, and the Irgun made good on its threat. It was a brutal, ugly turn, and it landed like a hammer on a British public already exhausted by Palestine. Within weeks, the cabinet was moving toward the decision to leave for good. For more than 70 years, the break stood as a monument to nerve. The audacity of young men who walked up to a fortress in stolen uniforms and dared to knock. But in 2020, a last secret surfaced. The plans that made it all possible, the map that showed exactly where the wall was weak, had come from a man named Paris Etkas, a Russian-born American engineer who worked for the British authorities, a man who had helped build the Acre prison himself. Quietly, he had handed the Irgun the drawings of his own fortress. Because the prison was like a fortress, he told his family years later, and unless they had the map, there was no way to get out. He never told the story publicly. He was afraid of losing his pension. The greatest jailbreak in history was not only an act of daring, it was an inside job, betrayed to the escapees by the very man who had raised the walls.